Good evening. I'm Evelyn Brooks. And tonight, I want to tell you about someone I never met, but whose voice I'll never forget. Her name was Margaret Holloway, a piano teacher from a small town in Ohio. And this is her story. No one in Cedar Falls knew why Margaret stopped playing the piano. One day she was there, her fingers dancing over the keys like water over stones. And the next, silence. Complete, devastating silence. The kind that makes a whole town hold its breath. It was October 1973. I remember because that's when I received her letter. Handwritten, on paper so thin you could see through it. She wrote to me because, well, back then people still believed radio hosts could carry their secrets safely. That we were like priests, I suppose. Confessors in the dark. Margaret was 42 years old. Never married. Lived alone in a white house at the end of Maple Street, the one with the porch that wrapped all the way around. Everyone in town knew that house. Not because it was grand, it wasn't, but because every afternoon at 4 o'clock, music would pour from its windows. Chopin, mostly. Sometimes Debussy. The neighborhood children would stop their bikes just to listen. But that October, the music stopped. Dear Miss Brooks, her letter began. I'm writing to you because I cannot speak. Not anymore. Not about this. I paused when I first read those words, sat in my studio, just me and the overhead light, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. You know that feeling, don't you? When you know you're about to learn something you can't unlearn. She had been teaching piano for 20 years. Started when she was 22, fresh out of the conservatory in Cleveland, full of dreams about concert halls and standing ovations. But life had other plans. Her mother got sick. Margaret came home to Cedar Falls to help, and somehow, she never left. The temporary became permanent. The dreams got quieter, and eventually, they stopped making noise altogether. But she didn't mind, she wrote. Teaching children to play, really play, not just press keys, had become its own kind of music. She had 17 students, knew all their families, went to their graduations, their weddings, watched them grow up and move away, and sometimes come back with children of their own. Then there was Daniel. Daniel Garrett was 7 years old when he first came to her door, September 1972. His mother, Claire, stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder, and Margaret said she'd never seen a child look so small and so old at the same time. His father had died 6 months earlier. Heart attack, 34 years old. Just gone. Claire worked 2 jobs now. The boy needed something, she said. Something to hold on to. Margaret took him on for free. Didn't even discuss payment. Something about the way he looked at the piano, like it was a locked door he desperately wanted to open. He was gifted. Not just talented. Gifted in a way that made Margaret's hands shake the first time she heard him play. After only 3 lessons, he could sight-read music that took other children months to master. His fingers seemed to know where to go before his mind did. And when he played, God, when he played, it was like the piano had been waiting for him all along. But here's what you need to understand. Daniel didn't smile. Not once in those first few months. He would come to lessons, play beautifully, perfectly, and leave without a word. His eyes were somewhere else, somewhere dark that a 7-year-old shouldn't know about. Margaret started staying late with him. After the lesson ended, she'd make hot chocolate, and they'd sit on her porch and she'd talk. About nothing, really. About birds. About the changing leaves. About her old cat, Fitzgerald, who slept on top of the piano, and sometimes purred so loud it sounded like he was playing bass notes. Slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, Daniel started coming back. Not all the way, but enough that one day, in November, he laughed. Just once. At something silly Fitzgerald did. But it was there. Real and bright and sudden, like a match struck in a dark room. Claire cried when Margaret told her, held Margaret's hands and cried, and said thank you over and over, until the words lost their shape. By spring, Daniel was playing in the school recital. Margaret had never pushed her students to perform. She believed music was personal, something you did for yourself first. But Daniel wanted to. He chose a piece himself. Bach, Prelude in C major. Simple, but only if you don't understand it. In the right hands, it's everything. Joy and sorrow and hope all at once. The recital was on a Tuesday evening in May. The school auditorium was packed. Parents, grandparents, siblings, the whole town, it seemed. Margaret sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, so no one could see them shaking. Daniel walked onto the stage in a suit that was slightly too big for him. Claire had bought it, hoping he'd grow into it. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. And then he played. Margaret wrote that she had never heard anything like it. Not in all her years at the conservatory, not in all the concerts she'd attended, not in all the recordings she'd collected. It wasn't technically perfect. He was still 7, still learning. But it was true. Every note meant something. Every pause held weight. When he finished, the silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the applause came like thunder. Daniel stood, bowed slightly, and walked off stage. And for the first time since his father died, Margaret saw him smile. Really smile. The kind that starts in your eyes. That should have been the end of the story, the happy ending. The boy who found music and music found him back. But you know it's not. You can hear it in my voice, can't you? That something went wrong. It was 6 weeks later, July. The kind of hot, thick summer day where the air doesn't move and time feels slow. Margaret was in her garden, deadheading roses, when she heard the sirens. Not unusual in a small town. Someone's barn caught fire, or old Mr. Peterson had another spell, but these were different, urgent, multiple vehicles. They were heading toward the Garrett house. Margaret dropped her shears and ran. She was not a young woman, not athletic, but she ran anyway, her chest burning, her vision blurring at the edges, because she knew. Somehow, she knew. The ambulance was already there when she arrived. Police cars, too. Neighbors standing in clusters on the lawn, hands over their mouths. Claire's car was in the driveway. Driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. Margaret pushed through the crowd. A police officer tried to stop her, but she kept going. And then she saw Daniel, on a stretcher, so still, too still. His eyes were closed. There was a blue tint to his lips. His small chest wasn't moving. They found him in the creek behind the house, the officer said later, face down in 2 feet of water. He'd been there at least an hour before Claire came home from work and found him. The official report said drowning. Accidental. He'd been playing near the water, slipped, hit his head on a rock. These things happen. Tragic. But they happen. Margaret stood there on the sidewalk, watching them load that small, still body into the ambulance, and something inside her broke. Not cleanly. Not the kind of break that heals. The kind that splinters into 1,000 pieces you'll spend the rest of your life stepping on. Claire didn't blame her. That almost made it worse. At the funeral, Claire held Margaret's hand and whispered, "You gave him music. You gave him something beautiful. Thank you." But Margaret couldn't hear it, couldn't accept it, because she kept thinking, if she hadn't taught him, if she hadn't made him love something so much, if she hadn't given him that moment on stage where he felt alive again, would he have tried so hard to hold on to it? Would he have been so desperate to feel that joy again, that he went looking for it in all the wrong places? The guilt was irrational. She knew that. Daniel had been playing by the creek, doing what 7-year-old boys do on summer afternoons. It had nothing to do with piano, nothing to do with music, nothing to do with her. But grief doesn't care about logic. Grief takes the truth and twists it until you can't recognize it anymore. She knew it didn't make sense, knew her thoughts were spiral staircases leading nowhere. But knowing something and feeling it are 2 different countries, and she was stranded in the second one. The day after the funeral, Margaret closed the lid on her piano. She canceled all her lessons, stopped answering the phone. When parents came to her door, concerned, asking what happened, she just said, "I can't anymore. I'm sorry, I can't." And the music stopped. Weeks became months. The house on Maple Street went silent. Margaret was still there. Neighbors saw her sometimes, walking to the store, tending her garden, But she was different, quieter, smaller somehow, as if grief had compressed her into something dense and dark. People tried to help, brought casseroles, invited her to church, asked if she wanted to talk. But Margaret had built a wall, and it was too high to climb. Her sister, Ruth, drove in from Columbus, spent a weekend trying to coax Margaret back into the world. They sat on that wraparound porch, drinking tea that went cold in their cups, and Ruth said all the right things. It wasn't your fault. He loved those lessons. You made his last months beautiful. You have to forgive yourself. But Margaret just stared at the street and said nothing. Because how do you explain to someone that forgiveness feels like betrayal? That moving on feels like forgetting? That every time she looked at the piano, she saw Daniel's small hands on the keys, and heard that prelude, and felt that brief, brilliant moment of joy that came right before everything ended? Ruth left on Sunday, hugged Margaret tight, and whispered, "Please don't disappear." But Margaret was already gone. That's when she wrote to me, 3 months after Daniel died. October 1973. "The leaves were turning," she wrote, and it made her think of that first November when Daniel laughed, how such a small sound could mean so much, how she'd give anything to hear it again. In her letter, she asked me a question I still think about. She asked, "Can a gift become a curse? Can something beautiful be the exact thing that destroys you?" She wrote about teaching Daniel, about watching him discover music and come alive through it, about that recital, that smile, that moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. And then she wrote about the guilt, about how every time she thought of him, she heard that Bach prelude, and it sounded like an accusation. "I should have protected him better," she wrote. "I should have known that giving someone something to love means giving them something to lose. What right did I have to teach him joy when I couldn't guarantee it would last?" I read that letter a dozen times before I responded, sat in my studio with a cup of coffee going cold, and thought about what to say. Because what do you tell someone who's drowning in grief? What words are big enough to hold that kind of pain? Here's what I wrote back. "You didn't teach Daniel to die. You taught him to live. For a few months, in the middle of the worst grief a child can experience, you gave him something that made life worth living again. That's not a curse. That's a gift, maybe the greatest gift there is." I told her that love always comes with the risk of loss, that beauty is always temporary, that joy is always fragile. But that doesn't mean we stop loving, stop creating, stop giving people reasons to smile. It means we do it anyway, especially when it's hard, especially when it hurts. I told her that Daniel's death wasn't her fault, that accidents are called accidents because no one's to blame, that sometimes terrible things happen to wonderful people, and there's no lesson, no meaning, no reason, just loss, and we have to find a way to live with it anyway. I mailed that letter on a Friday. Never heard back. For weeks, I wondered if she'd received it, if she'd read it, if it had helped at all, or just made things worse. I thought about calling, but something stopped me. Sometimes people need silence more than they need solutions. Then, 3 months later, I got another letter. Shorter this time. Just 2 pages. "Dear Miss Brooks," it began. "Thank you for your words. I'm not sure I believe them yet, but I'm trying. I wanted you to know that I'm donating my house to the town. I spoke with the mayor last week. It's going to become a music school. Free lessons for any child who wants them. I can't teach anymore. I'm not strong enough for that, but maybe someone else can. Maybe Daniel's story doesn't have to end with silence." She signed it simply, "Margaret." I kept that letter too, put it in the same box as the first one. And I thought about her, living alone in that house, surrounded by silence, making the hardest choice there is, to turn your pain into something that might help someone else. Margaret never played piano again. She lived another 8 years, died in 1981. Cancer, quiet and quick, the way she'd lived the last years of her life. She left everything to the music school. Her piano, her sheet music, her life savings, all of it. The funeral was small. Immediate family, a few old friends, some of the parents whose children she'd taught. Claire was there. She stood at the front during the service and talked about Margaret, about how she'd given Daniel a gift in his darkest time, about how that gift had given her, Claire, something precious, the knowledge that her son had been happy, at least once, at least for a little while. There wasn't a dry eye in that church. They buried Margaret on a Tuesday. Gray sky, cold wind, the kind of day where fall tips into winter. As they lowered the coffin into the ground, someone started humming. I don't know who it was. Maybe one of the old students, maybe Ruth, but others joined in. Slowly, quietly, the sound grew. It was the Bach prelude, the one Daniel had played, the one that had haunted Margaret for 8 years. But in that moment, in those voices, it wasn't sad. It wasn't an accusation. It was a memory, a tribute, a way of saying, you mattered. What you did mattered. We remember. I wasn't there. I was in New York, recording a segment about a completely different story. But Claire wrote to me afterward and told me about it, about the humming, about how it felt like Margaret and Daniel were both there somehow, both at peace. I'd like to think that's true. Holloway House School of Music opened in the spring of 1982. They renovated Margaret's house, fresh paint, new windows, but kept the bones the same. The piano stayed in the front room, exactly where it had always been. They put a plaque above it, in memory of Margaret Holloway, who believed music could heal. The first director was a woman named Sarah Chen. She'd been one of Margaret's students back in the 60s, remembered her as patient, kind, exacting. When Sarah heard about the school, she quit her job in Cincinnati and came home to Cedar Falls, said it felt like the right thing to do, like completing a circle. That first year, they had 43 students, children from all over town, some from neighboring counties. Most couldn't afford private lessons. Some came from broken homes. Some were grieving losses of their own. All of them found something in that house, something that felt like safety, like hope. Sarah told me once that she thinks about Margaret every day, wonders what she would say if she could see what her house became, wonders if she'd be proud or if the guilt would still be too heavy. I think she'd be proud. I have to believe that. Every year on Daniel's birthday, March 14th, the school holds a recital. It's open to anyone, students, teachers, parents, townspeople, anyone who wants to play. And at the end, they always perform the Bach prelude, together. All the pianists who are there, playing in unison. It's messy, it's imperfect. Some people miss notes, some rush the tempo, some get lost halfway through. But it's beautiful. God, it's beautiful. Because it's not about perfection. It's about remembering. About honoring a 7-year-old boy who loved music and a 42-year-old woman who taught him how. Claire still goes every year. She's 73 now. Lives in the same house where Daniel grew up, where he died. People have asked her why she never moved, why she stayed in a place with so much pain. She always says the same thing. Because it also has so much love. I can't forget the pain. But I won't forget the love either. She sits in the front row during the recital, closes her eyes when they play the prelude, and afterward, she thanks every single child who performed, shakes their hand, looks them in the eye, tells them they did beautifully, tells them to keep playing, to never stop. I visited Holloway House in 1989. It was a cold November afternoon, the kind where the light slants low and everything looks softer. I stood outside for a while, just listening, piano scales drifting through the windows, a child's laughter, a teacher's patient correction. I thought about Margaret, about her letter, about that question she asked me, can a gift become a curse? And standing there, listening to that music, I finally had an answer I believed all the way down. No, a gift is a gift. What we do with it, how we carry it, how we let it shape us, that's up to us. Margaret gave Daniel music. Music gave him joy. Joy made his short life richer. That's not a curse. That's grace. The curse was the guilt. The belief that loving something means being responsible for its loss. The idea that because Daniel died, the music she gave him was somehow tainted, wrong, dangerous. But that's not how love works. Love doesn't promise safety. It promises meaning. And meaning is worth the risk. Every single time. I wish Margaret had lived long enough to believe that, to see what her house became, to know that her grief didn't destroy the music, it multiplied it. 43 students became hundreds. One piano became a dozen. One teacher's. Love became a whole community's legacy. But maybe she knows now. Maybe wherever she is, she can hear those children playing. Maybe she's finally forgiven herself. Maybe she understands that Daniel's death wasn't the ending. It was a chapter in a much longer story. A story about how love survives loss. About how music continues even when we think the song is over. I still think about that letter sometimes. Keep it in my desk drawer at home. When I'm having a hard day, when the world feels too heavy, I take it out and read it again. Not because it makes me feel better. It doesn't, not exactly. But because it reminds me why stories matter. We tell stories because we need to know we're not alone in our pain, because we need proof that other people have survived what feels unsurvivable, because we need to believe that even our worst moments can become something meaningful if we're brave enough to share them. Margaret shared hers, and now, 40 years later, children in Cedar Falls are learning piano in her house, playing her instruments. Following in footsteps she thought she'd erased. That's not nothing. That's everything. I'm Evelyn Brooks, and this is the story I wanted to tell you tonight. The story of Margaret Holloway and Daniel Garrett, of a piano teacher and her student, of grief and guilt, and the long, slow road back to grace. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Don't be afraid to give people the things you love. Don't let fear of loss stop you from creating beauty, from teaching joy, from showing someone they matter. Because yes, it might hurt. Yes, you might lose them. Yes, the gift might feel like a curse when the loss comes, but the alternative is silence, and silence helps no one. Play the music, give the gift, take the risk, love people even when loving them means you might lose them. Because that's what it means to be alive. That's what it means to matter. Margaret Holloway mattered. Daniel Garrett mattered. And you matter too. Thank you for listening. And please, if there's someone you love, if there's something beautiful in your life, don't wait. Don't let fear tell you that caring means losing. Hold it close. Play the song. Give the gift. Because we don't get to choose how long the music lasts. We only get to choose whether we play it at all. Good night. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.